This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going back to the 1930s.
Oh, the 1930s.
A time when America was really grappling with its role in a world that seemed to be on the brink of war.
Right.
You know, you gave us some really great source material from Mr. Hutchings History.
Yeah.
And it seems like we're in for a really fascinating look at how events in Asia, specifically Japan's actions, really influenced U.S. foreign policy.
For sure.
In the years leading up to World War II.
It's such a fascinating period because it forces us to ask, you know, was President Roosevelt a reluctant participant in the events that led to war?
Yeah.
Or was he a master strategist carefully maneuvering the U.S. toward intervention?
Wow.
And it's a question historians still debate.
I love a good historical mystery.
Yeah.
Let's set the stage a little bit.
Okay.
America in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Still reeling from World War I.
Oh, absolutely.
There was this strong sentiment of isolationism.
Right.
This desire to just stay out of foreign entanglements.
Yes, and this isolationist sentiment was really codified in the Neutrality Acts, passed in mid-1930s.
Okay.
These acts essentially tied Roosevelt's hands when it came to responding to aggression overseas.
So the Neutrality Acts were meant to prevent the U.S. from getting dragged into another war.
Right.
But what did they actually do?
Yeah.
How did they restrict Roosevelt's options?
So imagine this, we're President Roosevelt.
Okay.
You see these alarming developments in Asia.
Uh-huh.
Japan is becoming increasingly aggressive, invading China, talking about dominating the region.
Yeah.
But the Neutrality Acts prevent you from selling arms to countries at war or even providing loans.
Wow.
You're essentially forced to sit on the sidelines.
I can see how that would create a real dilemma for Roosevelt, especially as someone who recognized the growing threat of the Axis powers.
Yeah.
He must have felt so frustrated.
He was walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
He had to balance his concerns about the rising tide of fascism and militarism with the very real political pressures at home.
Right, so we've got this backdrop of isolationism and the Neutrality Acts, and then in 1937, Japan invades China.
Yeah.
This is a major turning point, right?
Absolutely.
It's a full-scale invasion marked by shocking brutality, including the horrific events of the Rape of Nanking.
It's a truly horrific event.
Yeah.
Really tested America's commitment to isolationism.
You would think that something as horrific as the Rape of Nanking would have spurred immediate action from the U.S.
Right.
But it didn't. Why?
Because public opinion in America was still deeply divided. Some people were calling for intervention, arguing that the U.S. had a moral obligation to stop these atrocities.
Yeah.
But others clung to the idea of staying out of foreign conflicts. They just wanted to stay out of it.
So how does Roosevelt navigate this?
Right.
He can't just ignore what's happening in China?
No.
But he also can't blatantly violate the Neutrality Acts.
Exactly. This is where his political maneuvering comes into play.
Okay.
So he starts finding these creative ways to aid China without technically breaking the law.
Oh, wow.
Like, he approves the sale of aircraft to China, arguing that they're not technically arms because they are unarmed.
Interesting.
So it's a clever way to circumvent the restrictions.
It's a little bit like playing a game of legal loopholes.
Yeah.
Trying to find those gray areas that allow him to support China.
Right.
Without triggering a major backlash at home.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about supporting China.
Oh.
Roosevelt was also deeply concerned about the Soviet Union potentially stepping in.
Interesting.
He saw helping China as a way to counter the spread of communist influence in the region.
So he's got multiple layers to this strategy.
Yeah.
He's trying to aid China, contain Japan, keep the Soviets at bay.
That's right.
All while dealing with isolationist pressures at home. What a balancing act.
It really highlights the complexity of foreign policy decision-making.
Yeah.
You know, you have these competing interests, these shifting alliances, the constant need to weigh the potential consequences of every action.
And in the midst of all this, Japan is laying out their grand vision for what they call Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Yeah, the co-prosperity sphere.
What was that all about?
It sounds nice on the surface, right?
Yeah, co-prosperity.
Co-prosperity.
Sure.
But in reality, it was Japan's bid for regional domination.
Okay.
They wanted to control resources, establish puppet governments, and essentially create a Japanese empire in Asia.
Okay, so not so much co-prosperity as it is Japan calling all the shots.
Right.
This must have set off alarm bells in Washington.
Absolutely, especially after the fall of France and the Netherlands in 1940.
Okay.
Japan took advantage of the chaos in Europe to seize control of European colonies in Southeast Asia, including key territories like Indochina.
So now they're not just threatening China, but they're also expanding their reach into areas that directly impact U.S. interests. Things are escalating quickly.
Yeah, the U.S. can't ignore this.
Right.
You know, they have economic interests in the region, trade routes to protect a growing sense that Japan's ambitions pose a direct challenge to American power in the Pacific.
It's a powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah.
It seems like every move Japan makes is pushing the U.S. closer to the brink of war, whether they want it or not.
It's a classic case of how events in one part of the world can have ripple effects across the globe, and in this case, the ripples are turning into tidal waves.
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
In 1940, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy.
Right.
Solidifying the Axis powers. This is a huge development.
It's huge.
What does it mean for the U.S.?
The Tripartite Pact was a game changer.
Oh.
It meant that the conflicts in Europe and Asia were now intertwined. And even more importantly, it contained a clause stating that an attack on one Axis power meant war with all three.
So suddenly the U.S. is in a much more precarious position.
Right.
Any move against Japan could trigger a global war.
Yeah.
Roosevelt is truly walking a tightrope now.
Exactly. He has to find a way to deter Japan, support the Allies, and prepare the U.S. for a potential conflict, all while navigating the complex web of domestic politics and public opinion.
So what does he do? How does he respond to this growing threat?
Well, he starts taking bolder steps.
Okay.
He implements policies like cash and carry, which allowed warring nations to buy U.S. supplies as long as they paid cash and transported the goods themselves.
Okay.
It was a way to aid the Allies without officially entering the war.
It sounds like he's trying to thread the needle here.
Yeah.
Providing support without provoking a direct confrontation.
Precisely. And he's also pushing for increased military spending, bolstering U.S. defenses in the Pacific, and sending signals to Japan that their aggression won't go unchecked.
But he's still facing strong isolationist opposition at home, right?
Yeah, he is, but public opinion is starting to shift.
Oh, okay.
Especially as the horrors of the war in Europe become more apparent.
Right.
And Roosevelt is a master communicator. He uses his famous fireside chats to explain the situation to the American people.
Okay.
Make the case for a more active role in world affairs.
So he's really trying to prepare the nation for the possibility of war.
He is.
Even if many people aren't quite ready to accept it.
He understands that the U.S. can't remain isolated forever.
Right.
He sees the storm clouds gathering, and he's trying to steer the ship through increasingly turbulent waters.
This is all fascinating stuff. But before we move on, let's take a moment to consider how Japan viewed all of this.
Okay.
What were their goals, and how did they perceive the U.S.?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
Because understanding their perspective helps explain why they ultimately took such a drastic step.
All right, let's delve into the Japanese perspective.
Okay.
What were their motivations, and how did they see the U.S. as fitting into their plans? We'll get into that right after this.
For Japan, the 1930s was all about, securing their place in the world. They saw themselves as a rising power destined to lead Asia. And they viewed the U.S. as a major obstacle to their ambitions.
So in their eyes, the U.S. was standing in the way of their destiny.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold perspective.
It is.
But they believed that the U.S. was trying to contain them, prevent them from achieving their, rightful place as a dominant force in the region.
And this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, was that just propaganda, or did they genuinely believe in it?
It's a complex question.
Yeah.
On one hand, it was definitely a tool for propaganda, a way to mask their, imperial ambitions under this veneer of shared prosperity.
Right.
But on the other hand, there was a genuine belief among some Japanese leaders that they were bringing order and modernization to a chaotic Asia.
So a bit of self-deception mixed with a genuine sense of mission.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
They saw themselves as liberators freeing Asia from Western colonialism and ushering in a new era of Japanese leadership.
Okay.
Of course, this narrative conveniently ignored the brutal reality of their occupation and the exploitation that came with it.
Right. Their actions in China and elsewhere certainly didn't reflect a benevolent co-prosperity for all.
Exactly. And this is where the clash with the U.S. becomes inevitable.
No.
The U.S., with its own interests in the region and its commitment to these principles of self-determination and open trade, couldn't simply stand by and watch Japan create their own empire.
So we have these two competing visions for the future of Asia.
Right.
Japan seeking dominance.
Yeah.
The U.S. advocating for a more open and equitable system. No wonder tensions were running so high.
And these tensions were exacerbated by the economic sanctions that the U.S. imposed on Japan. These sanctions, especially the oil embargo, were seen by Japan as an act of economic warfare.
So from Japan's perspective, the U.S. wasn't just a rival, but an active threat to their very survival.
Exactly. They felt strangled backed into a corner.
Wow.
They believed that a decisive military strike was their only option.
This brings us back to Pearl Harbor. Was this attack simply about crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet, or was there a deeper strategic goal?
It was a calculated gamble.
Okay.
They hoped that a surprise attack would demoralize the U.S., force them to negotiate from a position of weakness, and ultimately allow Japan to consolidate its gains in Asia.
It's a bold, even reckless plan.
It is.
They severely underestimated the American response, didn't they?
To say the least, they misjudged the American resolve and the unifying effect that the attack would have on the nation. Instead of forcing the U.S. to back down, it galvanized public opinion and fueled this wave of patriotism that swept the country.
It's ironic, isn't it? Their attempt to avoid a prolonged war with the U.S. actually had the opposite effect.
Yeah, it's a classic case of miscalculation.
Wow.
You know, they thought they could deliver this knockout blow.
Right.
They ended up awakening a sleeping giant.
So Pearl Harbor is the turning point. The U.S. is now fully engaged in World War II.
Yes.
But before we get into the war itself, let's step back and consider the different historical interpretations of how the U.S. got to this point. You mentioned earlier that some historians view Roosevelt as a reluctant participant, while others see him as a master strategist. Could you elaborate on those contrasting perspectives?
Of course, let's start with the reluctant participant view.
Okay.
Historians in this camp argue that Roosevelt was genuinely constrained by the political climate, that he had to tread carefully because of the strong isolationist sentiment in the country.
So from this perspective, he was doing his best to navigate a difficult situation, trying to prepare the U.S. for the possibility of war without provoking a backlash at home.
Exactly. He had to be mindful of public opinion, congressional opposition, and the limitations imposed by the Neutrality Acts.
But then we have the master strategist perspective, which paints a very different picture of Roosevelt.
Right. Historians who hold this view believe that Roosevelt was always leaning toward intervention. That he saw the threat posed by the Axis powers and understood that the U.S. couldn't remain on the sidelines indefinitely.
So according to this interpretation, he was playing a long game, carefully maneuvering the U.S. into a position where they could effectively confront the Axis powers.
Yes, and he used a combination of diplomacy, economic pressure, and military preparedness to gradually shift the country's stance toward a more active role in world affairs.
It's almost like he was playing chess, anticipating his opponent's moves and setting the stage for the inevitable showdown.
That's a great analogy.
Wow.
And this is where the debate gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Was he truly constrained by isolationist forces?
Yeah.
Or was he subtly manipulating events to achieve his desired outcome?
It's a tough question to answer, definitively. There's evidence to support both sides of the argument.
And that's what makes history so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing dates and facts.
Right.
It's about grappling with these complex questions, considering different perspectives, and trying to make sense of the past.
So where do you stand on this debate? Do you see Roosevelt as a reluctant participant or a master strategist?
Personally, I lean towards the view that he was a bit of both.
Okay.
He was undoubtedly influenced by the political realities of the time, but he was also a shrewd and calculating leader who understood the stakes involved and was determined to protect American interests.
It sounds like he was a master of balancing competing priorities, navigating domestic politics, assessing international threats, trying to chart a course for the nation through these incredibly turbulent times.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that he didn't have the benefit of hindsight.
Right.
You know, he was making decisions based on the information he had at the time in a world that was rapidly changing and full of uncertainty.
So as we reflect on Roosevelt's actions in the years leading up to World War II, what are some of the key takeaways we should keep in mind? What lessons can we draw from this period about leadership foreign policy, and the challenges of navigating a complex world?
That's a great question, and one that I think is worth exploring in more detail.
All right, let's dive into those lessons. What can we learn from Roosevelt's experience that might be relevant to the challenges we face today? Yeah, thinking about his challenges back then, it really makes you appreciate, the complexities that leaders face even today.
Oh, absolutely.
Trying to balance those domestic pressures with global responsibilities. It's a constant tightrope walk.
Absolutely. And one of the key lessons we can draw from this period is the importance of understanding the perspectives of other nations.
Right.
Japan felt cornered, convinced the U.S. was trying to stifle their rise.
Right.
Their miscalculations led to devastating consequences.
Yeah, it's a reminder that clear communication and a willingness to see things from different angles could be so crucial for avoiding conflict.
Yeah.
But it's not always easy, is it?
No, it's not.
Especially when there were those competing interests at play.
It's a constant challenge, and one that Roosevelt grappled with, throughout his presidency. He had to balance that desire for peace with the need to protect American interests and uphold democratic values.
And he was making these decisions in a world that was rapidly changing.
Right.
With new threats emerging on the horizon, it must have been so difficult to predict how things would unfold.
He was operating in this fog of uncertainty, trying to make the best choices with the information he had at the time.
Right.
And, in hindsight, it's easy to criticize some of his decisions, but it's important to remember the context in which he was operating.
So what can we learn from his successes and his mistakes? How can his experience inform our understanding of leadership and foreign policy today?
One key takeaway is the importance of preparedness.
Okay.
Roosevelt, despite facing isolationist opposition, he worked to strengthen the U.S. military and build alliances.
Right.
He understood that being prepared for the possibility of conflict was essential for deterring aggression and protecting national interests.
That's a reminder that strength and a willingness to defend democratic values can be such powerful deterrents.
Yes.
But it's also about choosing your battles wisely, isn't it? Knowing when to stand firm and when to seek diplomatic solutions.
Precisely. Roosevelt tried to find a peaceful resolution with Japan, but he also recognized that appeasement wouldn't work.
Right.
There are times when a strong stance is necessary to protect vital interests and uphold core principles.
It's a delicate balance.
It is.
And it's a reminder that foreign policy isn't just about military might.
Right.
It's also about diplomacy, strategic communication, and building relationships with other nations.
Absolutely. And it's about understanding that the world is interconnected.
Yeah.
What happens in one region can have ripple effects across the globe. Roosevelt saw this firsthand as events in Asia and Europe ultimately drew the U.S. into a global conflict.
Yeah, it's a lesson that's even more relevant today in a world that's increasingly interconnected.
Absolutely.
Where challenges like climate change, economic instability, and global pandemics require international cooperation.
We can't afford to be isolationists in today's world. We need leaders who understand the complexities of global affairs, who can build bridges with other nations, and who are willing to act decisively when necessary to protect our interests and uphold our values.
So as we look back on Roosevelt's tightrope walk to World War II, it's not just about learning the history, but also about extracting those timeless lessons about leadership diplomacy and the importance of engaging with a complex world.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something that we read about in books.
Yeah.
It's a living tapestry that continues to shape our present and our future.
Right.
And by understanding the past, we can better equip ourselves to navigate the challenges of the present and build a more peaceful and prosperous future.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Filled with, intriguing insights and thought-provoking questions.
Yeah.
Thanks for guiding us through this complex period of history.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy exploring the past and uncovering those connections that help us understand our present.
And to our listener, we hope you found this journey through history as enlightening as we did.
We did.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from the past.
Yes.
It's the key to understanding our present and shaping a better future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.